Hey everyone, it's Nick with the Whip Shop, and in today's video I'm very excited to show you a whip that I just finished yesterday. This is a 12-foot 20-plat nylon bullwhip in chocolate brown made to resemble the whip used by the legend himself, Indiana Jones. There we go, that's better. This is a whip custom made for my friend Johnny down in Florida. Johnny's been a big Indiana Jones fan for most of his life, so he really likes those David Morgan style kangaroo hide bullwhips that you see in the films. So this is kind of my take, or I should say my tribute to a David Morgan bullwhip made with nylon instead of kangaroo hide. This whip has 3 plaited bellies and an overlay, so that's 4 total braided layers. And something that I mentioned in a few videos back, I think it was a couple years ago, the rollout that you can achieve with 3 bellies is fantastic. For some reason, just the way those strands all lock into place, you can get these beautiful loops that form. Now, given a whip with 3 plaited bellies, especially being 12 feet long, it's going to be a heavier whip. It's going to be a heavier whip, so it will crack more easily, but you have to get it going. Once you get that loop going, it'll put on that illusion that the whip is cracking itself. Now, this video is not intended to be a full-length, real-time tutorial building this whip. If you're interested in building a 20-plat, 12-foot nylon bullwhip, there's a video in the upper right-hand corner. You guys can click on that, and that's, I think, like 3 hours long, and I talk about everything I do as far as making one of these whips. This video is just more intended to show you a few little different things that I've changed over the years, as well as some things that I would do uniquely if I were making a bullwhip that I was trying to make look like a whip used in the Indiana Jones films. Handle. This is an 8-inch handle. It's a 2-strand side-by-side diamond plat, as you can see here. At the heel, I wanted to keep it nice and large, that classic large heel knot that you would see in a David Morgan style bullwhip. So here we have a 2-pass 7x6 Turk's head knot, and at the transition, we have a 2-pass 5x4. And because of the nature of how I build this whip, starting the first belly right before the handle ends, we get that natural little swell there that is seen quite often in a David Morgan style bullwhip. Something you'll notice with this color, chocolate brown, from the paracord store, by the way. There's a link in the description if you need parachute cord. I've been working with the paracord store for a few years now, and they're just wonderful. Always quality every time. Chocolate brown sort of has that weathered look after you wax the whip, and a lot of people really like that. At first it caught me off guard, but it just makes the whip look that much more like leather. We have a 5-strand flat braided wrist loop here at the heel, and coming off of the thong here, we're in 20 plat. The handle is 16 plat, but once we transition here to the rest of the whip, the thong, it expands to 20 plat. As we work our way down, we're dropping strands normally, and we end with a 4 plat with a 4-point fall hitch there. I have a nice, long, healthy tan fall with a black cracker. I tried to make this look as much as I could like leather. So the first thing we have here is a 9-inch piece of 7/32 inch spring steel. I've ground down the ends, and I'm fitting this piece of sinker cord 1.5 inches over the end. Now this sinker cord is filled 18 inches with BBs. As you can see down at the end, I've tied off the area where the BBs end. The next thing I'm doing here is I'm wrapping very tightly with vinyl tape, slightly above and all the way down the core. And this is the only place that I'll use vinyl tape to this day. I like the way that it constricts the BBs and it has ability to stretch. Once that's finished, I'm taking this lacing tape and I'm wrapping once again where I just wrapped with the tape, slightly above,
And I'm paying extra close attention to fill in that area where the steel ends. I want this to be a nice smooth transition instead of a drop-off. The diameter of the BB-filled sinker cord is slightly smaller than the handle itself, so I want this to be a smooth transition. And I'm going to be wrapping all the way down a couple of inches past those BBs, where the BBs end. Once I reach that point, I'm going to cut the lacing tape and just do a few knots to make sure that it's not going to become untied. There's going to be braided layers over this, so it won't, but I just like to be extra sure and tie a few extra knots. So the next step at this point is to go back to that transition, and I'm really paying close attention to fill in this area. I want it to be nice and stiff. This is a 12-foot long whip, and a whip that is this long and heavy experiences quite a bit of leverage force at the transition. So if you put in the time to get this part stiff, the whip won't become floppy over time. So I really want to make sure while I have access to this part of the whip that I do it right. So I'm just wrapping down and up several times to make sure, and just kind of waiting until I achieve the stiffness that I want. Then I'm tying off that. You can see I just snipped off that strand. Now I have here some hockey tape, and what I'm doing is I'm wrapping in a spiraled fashion all along that bare exposed steel. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow our layers of parachute cord to have something to grip to instead of slippery steel. So now I did one layer, and now I'm doing another, spiraling back up in the opposite direction. And this will just kind of bulk up the handle slightly. Again, giving the parachute cord a grippy surface to adhere to when I'm braiding it. Next, we're going to put the core assembly back in the clamp, and as you can see, I have the transition where the steel ends marked with that silver marker, and I have my 4 strands for my 8-plat first belly. As you can see, I have the middles marked on those as well, and I'm about ready to tie them on. So here's the first 2 strands, and I'm making sure that this belly begins about 1.5 inches above where the handle ends, again indicated by that silver mark. Feeding those strands through that eye and pulling the strands until I find the middles. Now it's very important that once I establish this 8-plat first belly, that I really pull these strands tightly. Again, for the previously mentioned reason, this is a vulnerable place of the whip where it has a tendency to become floppy. So I'm really going to see here, you're going to see in the next couple seconds, I'm going to be pulling these strands very tightly. You can see them starting to snug there at the top. And we're going under 2 over 2. Again, if you're interested in making a 12-foot whip, this video is not necessarily meant to be a full-length tutorial. This is just kind of a walkthrough of the whole process, and we'll be spending more time on certain details than in others. So pulling very tightly here, and I'm just going to be doing this under 2 over 2 all the way down until I drop several strands. Again, the full-length video that I mentioned tells you exactly where to drop strands. This is just kind of showing the process. And here we have the finished first belly. You can see where the strands have been dropped. There's a couple there. There's one there. And we end the belly with 4 strands. The next step is going to be to take our hockey tape, and we're going to wrap right where that first belly begins. We're going to wrap very tightly in this spiral fashion like this. Nice and tight. And I'm going to continue wrapping till about 12 inches on this belly. 1 foot. At this point, I'm going to grab my scissors, and we're going to snip that, and I'm just going to take it in my hand and mold it, make sure all of the surfaces of the tape are touching the belly. Next step is going to be to bind our first belly with our lacing tape. Next thing I'm doing here is I'm trimming those dropped strands, and the idea is to make them about 1 millimeter long, kind of fray them a little bit, and then just melt them and press them into the belly. So every time I drop a strand on all layers besides the overlay, I'm doing this. Give them a little pull, give them a little snip, and a melt. And that's just going to lay things down nice and flat. We'll be dropping strands differently, of course, on the overlay. It doesn't matter here because you won't see them. The next step here is to once again reach for our lacing tape, and I'm going to be binding this first belly. And the way I'm going to be doing it is I'm just going to be doing this crisscross pattern. I find that it's a very substantial, a very firm pattern when wrapping, and this is just going to provide a lot of strength to the transition of the whip. Especially a whip this long and heavy, there's a lot of force that's exerted on the transition of the whip, where the handle ends and the braided portion begins. So I really want to make sure that I pay extra close attention to making this part as rigid as possible. Now, this is just sort of personal preference. Some people prefer to have the transition a little looser than other people. I prefer to have it somewhere in the middle. So I'm just going down and up several times. And here's the finished product, well, I should say almost the finished product of the first belly wrapped. We're going to be wrapping it a little bit more on the transition area for the previously mentioned reason. But first, I'm going to put the whip down and roll the whip. Now, this roller you see me using is something my father built for me. It's got a couple handles on it, and it has a rubber neoprene bottom, and it really helps grip that whip. Also, I have a sheet of neoprene rubber on the ground to make sure that it rolls instead of slides. Now the whip is back in the clamp again, and as I mentioned, I'm now wrapping one more layer with this lacing tape. And the idea here is to wrap it in such a way that it's 100% coverage. So every wrap, I think I'll zoom in here in a second, every wrap of this stuff is making contact with the edges of the previous wrap. And doing so gives a really strong binding. Right there you can see each wrap, the edges are touching the wrap of the previous revolution around the whip. And I'm going to do this all the way back up to the top. Again, this is optional, but I do highly recommend it for a whip that's this long. Now that that's done, I have these strands ready to go. And this is a 10 plat. This is the second belly of this whip. And we're just going to be going under 3/2. Under 3/2. And I'm starting this belly at the transition. Now, this won't be the final resting place of this belly. In a few minutes, we're going to be sliding this whole assembly up to the top of the handle. The only belly that we start at the transition is the first belly on a whip like this. So I'm just establishing a few strands to get the pattern down under 3/2, 10 plat. And I'm not pulling very tightly yet. This is just to establish, as I mentioned, the sequence. So once I get a few inches here, 2-3 inches, I'm going to take the whip out of the clamp, and everything is loose enough so I can just slide it to the top. And of course, because it gets smaller, it'll slide even more easily. So I'm going to put that in the clamp right there. And if we take a look at the top there, I'm going to push this all the way up, and I'm going to overlap the handle about 1/4 inch. So I want the tops of the strands to spill over 1/4 inch. Now I'm just individually tightening these strands. And once they're where I want them, now I'm really going to tighten them permanently. Again, things might wander a little bit until we have all of those strands tightened, and that's okay. A couple more there. And we can kind of see the little strands tightening if we look at the top. I'm going to go one more on the left side here for all strands. And that feels nice and solid. So once that's in place and it's not going to move, I'm going to take the whip out of the clamp again and put it in this way so I'm not having to work around the edges of the vise. That's one of the most frustrating things, to have to pull the strands around the sides of the vise. So this just keeps everything out of the way. And now I'm going to continue under 3 over 2. And now I'm pulling nice and tight. Now pretty soon what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be, and this is just for the handle, I'm going to be grabbing 2 strands at the same time, but the sequence remains the same. See, now I have 2 strands. I'm going to go around the back under 3 over 2 while holding 2. And this just speeds up the process. Under 3 over 2, 2 strands at a time. And this does not change the integrity of the strength of the handle. This just speeds up the process. There's no need. This is going to be covered up by 2 more layers. There's no need to do single, individual strands under 3 over 2. So once I reach the transition here, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different that you may have seen me do in previous videos. Now here I'm going to be taking the strands, I'm going to be going over 1, under 1, over 1, under 1, over 1, 1 strand at a time. And this is going to create a diamond pattern. And a diamond pattern has a lot more surface area, a lot more strands over and under other strands. So it's a much more rigid plaiting pattern. And I like to do this on the transition of specifically heavier, longer whips, because this is just a more rigid pattern. So I'll do this for a little ways, and then we'll just go straight into a herringbone pattern. But this is just a standard 10 plait diamond braid. Because we have an odd number of strands on the left and the right, we're starting by going over. So grabbing that strand, see we go over. I guess I started that over. There we go. We're going to go over, under, over, under, and over. We always want to finish with an over. So even if that means starting with an over, conventionally, when there's an even number on the left and the right, we start with an under and end with an over. But this is different because, as I mentioned, it's an odd number of strands. So as you can see, I have braided this diamond pattern for about 3.5 inches. And then at that point, I go straight into a single strand under 3 over 2, just how we started the belly. And notice just how stiff that transition is. It really makes a world of difference to do that diamond pattern on the bellies. So I've just been braiding under 3 over 2, just working my way down, pulling nice and tight. I'm paying extra close attention to how hard I pull. If you're going to pull the strands tightly on a whip at any part, the part that you really want to focus on pulling as tight as you can comfortably is on the transition. And once you start to work your way down, you can sort of ease off the pressure a little bit. So here we go. Here's looking down the whip on the second belly. We're dropping strands as we go. Just working our way down. And now once again, I'm snipping those dropped strands because we finished this belly. Just a little snip and a melt, just pushing them into the core. If you're doing this for the first time or you don't have very many whips that you've made, I recommend covering your fingers so you don't burn them on the molten parachute cord. My fingers are calloused though, so I can just do this. I'm always doing it. I probably should take better care of my fingers, but a little snip and a melt. And just pressing them into that belly. And there we have it. The next step is, once again, we're going to reach for our hockey tape. And we're going to just start right where that little swell starts, right there. And we're just going to wrap in a spiraled fashion down. And this is just going to provide a layer, kind of a netting, so that the wrapping doesn't slip between those strands of parachute cord. So again here, I'm wrapping in that same way, that crisscross pattern, about 45-degree angles. And I've decided this is probably my least favorite part of whip making. The binding, for some reason, is so tedious to me. And I'm going down and up 2 times. The first time I go down, I'm going down about 2 feet, and then the next pass about double that. And then I'm coming back up. The idea is to kind of fill in the areas that you haven't wrapped already, just to kind of provide even coverage with the lacing tape. So now we're coming up to the top again, making sure to pull extra tight the nearer we are to that transition area. And now I'm coming back down again. Now when you go ahead and watch the full-length, real-time tutorial of making one of these long 12-foot whips, you'll notice that I use artificial sinew to do this binding. The difference here is that I'm using lacing tape. It's been a few years since I've switched over to lacing tape, but I find it works a lot better as far as rigidity. So here is the second belly. Almost completed. We are going to set it back in the vise. And again, we're going to do that really tedious wrapping where we leave no surface unwrapped. All the way up. This lacing tape is nice because it doesn't stretch and it's not nearly as oily as artificial sinew, so that's definitely something I consider to be an upgrade from the previous material I was using. So after probably about 10 minutes, it is a very time-consuming process to do this type of wrap, but notice how rigid that transition is. It's rock solid, and that's what we want. And as you use the whip, this loosens up a little bit over time, but the tighter you wrap it from the beginning, the more springy the whip is going to be in the long run, years down the road even. So we're almost to the top here. And then we're just going to be tying this off so that it doesn't come undone. And I just want everything to be nice and smooth. So now I'm just doing a series of half-hitch knots where I just tie this off. And I do it 2, 3, maybe 4 times, depending on how important it is, I guess you could say. And it's a pretty important part. So my scissors are over there, so I just grabbed a utility knife to cut that. And there we have the finished second belly. At this point, I have tied on the strands for our third and final belly. Now this is going to be a 12 plat belly. And again, I'm assembling everything at the transition for convenience sake. 12 strands, we're going to be going under 3 over 3. Again, I'm just establishing the sequence. And then we'll be sliding this up to the top as well after I get my camera to focus there. Under 3 over 3. I'm plaiting very loosely here, just to establish the sequence. Oh man, I forgot to turn my phone off, sorry. And again, 2, maybe 3 inches, just so it's obvious that everything is the way it should be. And now I'm sliding the whip up. I'm sliding the whole assembly up. Again, I want it to be pretty much lined up with the top of that second belly. So right up there, I want it to overlap the handle, the steel, about 1/4 of an inch. And now we can put it back in the clamp. And this is just repetition, guys. This is the same process for all these bellies, but just with a different number of strands. So, of course, previously we're doing 10 strands, now we're doing 12. And of course, the idea is, if you're not too familiar with whip making, each belly, each layer of the whip has a higher number of strands, and that's how we get the whip to be thicker. If we were to use, 10 strands for the third belly, there wouldn't be enough strands to sufficiently cover that belly underneath. So we need more surface area in the form of more strands. So at this point here, once I pulled those, again, we're going to slide it down, put it in the clamp again, and we can continue on. Again, I'll probably pull these strands individually. I'll probably plait them individually, as you see here, under 3/3. But pretty soon we're going to go back into the pulling 2 strands at the same time, like right now. I jumped the gun there, almost. Really making sure that I pull that nice and tight so it's not going to go anywhere. So as you can see, I did about 3 inches, and then I went straight into the 2 strands. And now here's the transition. I went back into the single strand diamond. Now, because we have an even number of strands on the left and the right, we're going under 1, over 1, under 1, over 1, under 1, and over 1. 1 strand at a time. And this is a very sturdy plaiting pattern. I don't believe I did this in my 12-foot bullwhip tutorial from a few years back. So this whole diamond plait business here that you see at the transitions is something that is still fairly new, but I've had great results with it, and I highly recommend it for a whip that's longer. And now, once I've established about 4 or 5 inches of the single strand diamond pattern, I'm going back into the herringbone, which is 1 strand at a time, under 3, over 3. As you can see, I have dropped a couple of strands already, bringing us down to a 10 plait. Now the sequence is under 3 over 2. Under 3 over 2. Again, I'm pulling fairly tightly here. Not as tight as I was pulling at the transition area, because this part of the whip is not experiencing as much leverage force. So you can see those little dropped strands that have consequently been dropped. As we work our way down the whip, we're dropping those strands to cause the whip to taper, to get skinnier as we reach the end. You might notice that I have little markings with silver marker. You see right where those drop strands are? Now I'm just trimming those drop strands like I've done before. But the reason that I will mark those little points at the whip is because it's an easy indicator of how many feet the belly is, so I don't have to measure the whole thing over again. I couldn't resist taking a break here. I saw this red-tailed hawk sitting on my neighbor's fence. Unfortunately, he's probably looking to feast on my birds that I feed. So as long as it stays over there, I'm fine. Back into the shop, I'm still trimming those drop strands. Again, I'm pulling them first, and then I'm snipping them at the base. I'm melting them and then pressing them into the belly. And that's a perfect example. See, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's the 7-foot mark. So I don't have to keep measuring, and I think I'm pointing that out there. Again, these are just more strands that we're snipping off. It's such a quick way to drop strands, to drop them to the outside. And there's no reason to drop them to the inside like we would normally do on an overlay, because you can't see them anyway. Working our way down, and that belly is done. Back to the hockey tape. Again, starting the wraps where the swell begins. And this is just repetition. Every belly is more or less the same principle. It's just with different strands and different lengths of tape. So every time we wrap with tape, we're basically going a little bit further. We never really want the tape to end on a previous belly at the same place it ended on the next belly. And that's just the whole staggered thing that we're trying to do to encourage taper. So here is the nearly finished third belly. Back in the clamp, as you can see, I've marked there the top, the 12 o'clock position. And now I'm taking this piece of hockey tape, just one strip, and this is just going to not only provide a little bit of rigidity, because we're about ready to wrap this with some lacing tape, but it also kind of helps me see where I've already wrapped, because there's so many strands so many wraps of that lacing tape. This just helps me to determine where I've already gone. And maybe at this point you can kind of understand why the wrapping part of making a whip, the binding, is probably, as I mentioned, my least favorite part, just because it's very tedious. It's tiring too. It's not like I'm, pulling with an insane amount of force, but when you're pulling tension, maybe 10, 15 pounds with every wrap, it really does add up, and you'll find yourself with quite a sore back and shoulder pretty quickly. So I went down, and now I'm coming back up, and pretty soon we will be transitioning back into the wrapping where we're not leaving anything uncovered. So right there, as you can see, all that distance that I'm going to have to cover wrapping in this fashion, where the strand's previous edge is making contact with the current edge of the strand of the lacing tape. And we're going all the way up. I don't think I show it all. Hopefully I don't. I'm sorry if I do. Yeah, so here we are working our way through almost to the top. But look at how smooth that surface is. Now this is our last chance to make the binding as stiff as possible. We'll never have access to this part of the whip ever again, so while we do have access to it, I like to really take the time to make sure that I wrap everything nicely. And sometimes that means unwrapping a little bit if I don't feel like the previous edges were touching sufficiently. I might back up an inch or two and rewrap. So it's best to do it as nicely and neatly as we can from the beginning. And here we're almost finished. And once you reach this point, this is a really good feeling, because deep down this is the last bit of intense wrapping that I have to do, the last bit of intense binding that I have to do with this whip. The only step really next that's very time consuming is putting the overlay on, the 12-foot overlay of the whip. So again, just a couple of half-hitch knots to make sure that those strands are secured. We want to make sure that this part never comes unwrapped. This is kind of part of the lifeline of what makes the whip so springy, all those wraps. So if there is a cut somewhere in those strands, it's going to become unraveled inside the whip internally. And you'll really notice a difference when you crack the whip. It'll be more loose. So after I have tied that down, I know it's not going anywhere, and I'm happy. And I'm just going to cover that little top part with a piece of hockey tape for good measure. Look at how stiff that transition is. It might almost look too stiff, but once you get, here I'm marking the 12 o'clock position, so when I take this out, if I need to take it out, I'll be able to know what the top is. What I was going to say was it may sometimes seem like it's too tight, but once you finish that whole 12-foot overlay, the way the physics works, this is going to be perfect. And here is the finished product. The final belly is complete, belly number 3, all the wrapping. I'm happy with it. There's an extra close-up. You can see those wraps. There's Tipper. She's actually in here now. So here we go, guys. This is all the strands. These are all of the strands. There are a total of 10 strands that we're going to be braiding. 10 folded strands. This is a 20 plait whip. So you kind of cut them, gut the parachute cord, and you'll kind of have a little bit of fear on your face if you haven't done this before. You got to think to yourself, I'm going to be touching every last millimeter of these strands. All this has to be braided. Check this out, guys. A full moon is rising, and there are these beautiful
alto cumulus. I'm not exactly sure what they are, but look at this. Look at this. It's beautiful. Man, that's just... I've been having a really good night for some reason. Just feel extra happy for some reason. I'm not exactly sure why, you know. But man, you step outside, it's a Friday night, you see that. Man, just makes you feel even better, you know?
Okay, we're back in the shop. I just wanted to share that with you guys. It was a really wonderful, peaceful experience, and I figured I'd put it in here as a little break, so I hope you enjoyed those visuals of the clouds and the moon coming up. Here we have our overlay strands. Now we're going to be doing something differently with this particular whip. I'm actually going to be tying this overlay on at the transition, just a couple of inches above the transition. And we're not going to be sliding this up to the top like you would see me do in other whips that are 12 feet long. And the reason I'm doing that is because I just want a clean transition between the handle strands and the overlay strands of the thong of the whip past the handle. So the sequence for 20 strands is 1 strand at a time, under 5, over 5. Now it might be a little bit difficult at first to distinguish between 5 and 5. There are a lot of strands here, relatively speaking, so take extra or pay extra attention just to make sure that you're not going like under 6 or over 4. Just make sure that you separate everything, and everything will kind of fall into place. It's muscle memory. Once you kind of feel what 5 strands in your fingers feels like, it'll go more smoothly. So just take your time with this. We're doing under 5, over 5. See, I'm having a little bit of difficulty distinguishing which strand is which there. See what I'm talking about? One might overlap the other. If you're ever in question, give that strand a little tug and watch what happens to the strand above it, and that's a good way to know which strand you're working with. So still going under 5, over 5. And again, similar to the bellies, I'm not pulling that hard just yet. I'm just establishing that sequence of under 5, over 5. And pretty soon you'll see me kind of shimmy everything into place. In the long run, what we're going to be doing is trimming this overlay, and you'll see what I mean by that later. But just know that this is where we're starting the overlay. As you can see here, I have established that plat count, still under 5, over 5. And the beginning of where I put that overlay, start of the assembly, it was about 2 inches before that swell that we were looking at earlier. And you can go a little bit higher too. You can go 3 inches before the swell. As long as you have no knots or everything looks neat right where the swell starts, everything will be fine. So this is just platting under 5, over 5. Again, I made sure that I pulled extra tight there at the transition, because for the previously stated reasons, the past 3 times, that is where the whip is experiencing a lot of leverage force. So here we're working our way down. Here's just kind of a different angle. And as you can see, we have a short strand there, so it's about time to drop that strand. Now from here on out, every time we drop a strand, we're going to be dropping it to the center. We're not going to be dropping it on the outside because we would see that. So here we're getting ready to drop a strand from the right-hand side. And I'm just snugging up the strands below it and some of the strands above it. So see, we have 2 below. I'm going to pull that to the middle. And again, I go into much greater detail about dropping strands in the full-length video. This is just meant to be kind of a talk-through, a walkthrough, to just show you guys the process of what it takes to make one of these Indiana Jones-style bullwhips that are 12 feet long. So now temporarily on the right-hand side, we're going under 5, over 4, because there's only 9 strands on the right now since we dropped that one. Still, on the left, we're going under 5, over 5. So that strand was dropped. Continuing on, Getting ready to drop another strand from the left-hand side now, giving it a pull and pulling it to the middle there. And that will be its final resting place. Now, on the right-hand side, we're going under 5/4. And also on the left, we're going under 5/4. It's balanced. Again, paying extra close attention to make sure that I'm pulling those strands evenly as far as tension goes. Under 5/4. You can see that strand that we just dropped in the middle. Sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to keep that dropped strand on top. We want it to be in the 12 o'clock position or very close to that. Sometimes they have a tendency of sneaking around the side and will end up behind the whip. And we don't want that to happen. We want it to stay at the top. And see now, once I've established several strands on top of that one, I've been plaiting for a while, I can go ahead and pull that dropped strand and snug it into place. Going to give it a snip and a melt. Once it's melted, I'm going to press it into the belly beneath. So here is the overlay. We've been working our way along, making some progress. This is probably about 3 hours of work right here. And there's the 7-foot mark. And we're just plaiting and dropping strands as we go. Again, for exact drop points, please watch the full-length video about making a 12-foot 20-plat bullwhip. And we're just continuing to plait along here. At this point, we are in 10 plat. Here's a little view. All the way up, you can really start to get an idea of how much you've been plaiting when you look up and just see how long of a whip you're working with. So we're currently in 10 plat, under 3/2 on the left and the right side. And this is definitely a video that I'm going to speed up. Just meant to be kind of a little time lapse showing you untangling strands as we go and just the natural setting of what it's like to be plaiting a whip this long. So I have a lot of respect for all of you whip makers out there who have made 20, 30, and 40-foot bullwhips. The longest whip that I've ever made was 14 feet, and that was back in 2014 or 15. And I was still fairly early in my whip making career, but it was a lot of work. I mean, you know, even a 12-foot whip is quite a lot of work, and it's kind of easy to sometimes forget just how much work it takes to make a whip this long. And now we have reached the end. We're ending in a 4-point fall hitch. We can see all of the work that we've done. And we're ending this whip with 4 strands. And at the very end, we're plaiting over no strands, so there is no core. And that's something that I really like to do with my whips so that I can ensure that the point is nice and thin. It's really nice to have a very steep ratio, you know, having a thick beginning to the whip where the handle is and the thong is, and finishing it with a very small point like this. This is just a standard 4-point fall hitch. We see the fall that I've already made there. Plenty of videos on how I did that. And then I'm just tying off each strand that I tie a half hitch in. I don't want to accidentally do that strand again twice. So as soon as I slip it through, you'll see me just tie a little knot in it just to distinguish between the ones we have and have not already tied. So there's the second one there. The nylon fall that I made in tan is 24 inches. Here comes the third one. But yeah, I challenge, or I should say I highly suggest and recommend that if you've kind of been dabbling with whip making for a year, maybe a few months. You've made some 6-foot whips, maybe a 7 and an 8 here and there. At least try. At least, push yourself to make a whip this long. And maybe even with 3 plaited bellies like this one, because once you go back to a conventional 6-foot 2-belly whip, it's going to make things a lot easier. There's the little intro, the part that we saw in the intro of this video. And a lot of people will probably say, that last strand was twisted. And yes, it was. So I'm getting it out right now. You didn't see that in the intro. Just feeding it through the fall. Now I'm going to individually tighten each one of these strands. But first, I'm going to pull the fall a little bit. And now I'm just one at a time, starting at the top, pulling the first strand. And then we'll be pulling the second strand. So I'm just pushing that together. Once we pull the fall into place, those little spaces in those half-hitch knots will be eliminated. They're already looking better, to be honest. So I've pulled all of them, and now I'm just going to cut, leaving about an inch. Also the one that we fed through the fall, I'm going to snip that one as well. Reaching for the lighter. It's very important. Every place on a whip that you have exposed cut parachute cord, you will absolutely want to fray it. And this is especially important the further down the whip we are. I meant to say melt. So now I'm going to be exposing the middle strand. This is 2 strands fed inside. And we took care of that. Apparently I didn't film the end of that, but there are plenty of other videos where I talk about that. At this point, it's time to roll this beast. So I have here a sheet of neoprene rubber, again on the floor. There's the first test crack. Rolling the whip out. So I have my whip roller here. It looks like I've forgotten to edit this part out. I'm just moving the camera there on the tripod. And now it's time to roll. So I'm really putting all my body weight on this. Like this is pretty much the last roll of the whip. So every time we roll a whip, especially the overlay, every time we roll it, we're still adding a little bit of compression to those bellies underneath, in addition to the overlay that we're rolling right now. So you can actually kind of breeze through those bellies, rolling the bellies. You don't have to pay that much attention, just get it as flat as you can. But whenever I roll an overlay, I spend about 3 or 4 times as much time rolling. For one, because this is the part of the whip that's visible. So for cosmetic purposes, I like people to see a nice looking whip. And after rolling it a few more minutes, here is the finished overlay rolled. There's a bit of a close-up for you. You can see all those little tiny gaps that you sometimes naturally see in the plaiting are eliminated. There's the handle. You can see the little swell there. Looking at the different parts of the whip, you can see just how much rolling does. It makes such a huge difference. It's a very important step in making any whip, both leather and synthetic. And there it is. You see the taper looks good. And at this point, it's time to work on the handle. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this marker here, apparently. I'm measuring this. So I want to hold a straight edge against the whip and see right where that swell is, right where that little tiny space starts, right there. That's where we want to mark the whip. So right about there. See how it's flush? And then just north of the swell, you can see there's that tiny little indentation right where that little V begins. I'm just going to mark it with a permanent marker. And this is where we're going to be wrapping it with our lacing tape. And ultimately, this is where we're going to be cutting just the surface layer, just that overlay. We're going to be cutting that. And we want to be really careful here. Again, the reason that I'm doing the handle separate from the rest of the whip is because in previous videos, I would just like inject a strand, I called it, or insert 2 strands at the transition. And I felt like I got it down pretty good, but it was just never clean enough for me. I just wanted to do it all separate so I didn't have to worry about injecting strands. So right where we made those marks a couple minutes ago, I'm taking this lacing tape once again, and I'm just wrapping very tightly. And once we cut those surface strands, this is what's ultimately going to be holding things in place. And further down the line, what we're going to be doing is taking a little bit of electrical tape, vinyl tape, and just wrapping it over the top of these wraps. And the purpose for that is so I don't accidentally nick the lacing tape. So now, since I've wrapped it a few times, very tightly, mind you, I wrapped this very tightly, and I'm still wrapping tightly. I've slid a little loop in there, and you can see that, and that is how we're going to tie this down. Instead of just doing a few half-hitch knots, I want it to be even more flush, flat, and secure. So I've wrapped over that loop a couple of times. Now I'm snipping it with the scissors and just sticking it through the loop, holding tightly, and then pulling the loop through. And notice how it just tucks it right underneath, and then we can cut it flush with the rest of the wraps, like that. And then snip off the beginning wrap too, or the beginning little tag strand, if you will. So now I'm using sign language apparently to try to show you that we're going to be cutting this now. But first, here's what I just mentioned a couple minutes ago. We're just going to wrap a little bit of electrical tape over those wraps of lacing tape just to protect the lacing tape. If we accidentally cut that lacing tape, it's going to become unraveled, and that would cause kind of a time-consuming problem that we don't want. Here's a fresh razor blade, and I'm going to ever so gently just skim the surface like this. And you can probably use a scissor, like a very sharply pointed scissors, to do this. It might be safer, actually. I think I do switch to the scissors here momentarily, but this is just yeah, see, here we go. I'm too scared. I'm too scared to commit to using the razor blade because I'm scared I'm going to cut into the belly underneath. Well played, Nick. You don't want to mess this thing up. So I'm just sticking the tip of the scissors underneath these strands and cutting them. And once we have all of them cut, they'll kind of just, they'll peel out like you're peeling a, I don't know what would be a good example for that. But just one or two at a time, just sticking the scissors in. And it's going to feel weird doing this. It's going to feel weird doing this at first. But as long as you get those wraps securely that we just did, if you're confident in those, you don't have to worry. It's all going to peel right back to the tape. See, now I think I just have a couple more that I might have to cut. It looks like I got them all, actually. Maybe there's one more. I don't know. Let's see. Nope. Okay, so now I'm back to the razor blade. And the scissors just don't quite do it for me as far as getting nice and close. I want to cut as closely as possible to the tape. So I find if I just put the flat part of the razor blade against the tape, especially when it's a fresh razor blade, just a slight sawing motion. Almost got away, didn't it? There was one left. And just one at a time. And this is something that this is a stage of the whip that you want to make sure that you have time. Like if you're late for something or you got to leave in 10 minutes, save this part until you have time, because you don't want to rush this part. If you nick that little, even one of those wraps of the lacing tape, your overlay is going to start to become unraveled. And that can be a real pain to catch that before it gets bad. And this part's kind of satisfying. This is a part that I like to really take my time on. And sometimes I'll actually let this step be the last thing I do for the night when I'm making a 12-foot whip, or any whip for that matter. One at a time. And a fresh razor blade like this, it just slices through so easily. I buy razor blades in bulk because I always want my blades to be as fresh as possible, especially for something this important. So after this, I'll just throw it in a bin and use it for more crude cutting. But I always use a fresh razor blade for something so important such as this. I believe that's the last strand. You see how we did here. We're going to go ahead and take off our electrical tape. And the idea is to have all of those cut strands as close as possible to our lacing tape wraps. So here we go. Let's see how we did. Not too bad at all. Now you see those little fringes there? Those little frayed areas? Those are okay. Those are okay. Because of the nature of how parachute cord frays, those will just flatten down evenly and be a nice little ramp there. I'm just going to take a little bit of hockey tape to hold those down. It's not a 100% necessary procedure to do this, but I just like to do it. Makes me feel better. Makes me sleep better at night. There we go. Just kind of molding it with the fingers, making sure all surfaces are making contact. As you can see, I've wrapped a little bit more tape there, just because I was paranoid about it coming out. Now, here are the strands for our handle. The handle on this whip is 8 inches long, so I want my strands to be twice the length of the handle. And this is a 16 plat handle, so that means I have 8 folded 32-inch strands. Here's the first 4. Again, I'm tying these at the transition for convenience purposes. I found the middles of all these strands as well. That's something else to know. All these strands are being tied directly in the middle. And I have the remaining strands in my other hand. I'm opening up a little eye here. Here's something you've seen many times on this channel. Feeding all 4 strands through, close the eye, and then one by one, I'm pulling those strands until I get to the middle. And it's important, in my opinion, to mark the middles. That way you're not constantly wondering where the middle is. It just makes sense to either take the lighter and just score it with the flame to create a little melted area. Or if you wanted to, you can just cut them in half and fuse them together. It's up to you. As long as you have the middles easily recognized, that's all that really matters. So I'm just feeding through one at a time. Here comes the next one. And we're about to tie a 16 plat 2-strand diamond pattern. That's what's going to make up this handle of this whip. Here we go. The sequence is going to be 2 strands at the same time, and it's going to be under 2, over 2, under 2, over 2. 2 strands at the same time. Now, if you want to, you can do single strand for this. You can take 1 strand and go under, over, under, over, under, over, under, over. But I kind of like the look of doing 2 at the same time. Under 2, over 2, under 2, over 2. Now this can be a little bit tricky. You see the strands on the left, how they're all kind of stangled up in there a little bit? That's okay. Don't worry about that. Just take your time after each pass to make sure that there aren't other strands on top of other strands. Now, as you can see, I've worked my way down, again, not pulling super tight. And the reason for that is so I can shimmy this up to the very top. All the way to the top like this. We'll put the whip in the clamp, and we'll tighten things down. It's in the vise, looking good. And again, we want the very beginning of this handle plaiting to be about 1/4 of an inch past that steel where the rest of the bellies are. And now I'm really cinching down 1 strand at a time, pulling very tightly. And don't let it scare you if quite a bit of slack comes out of each strand. That's okay. That's pretty normal. It might pop a little bit as the little melted sections of your middles slide through the strands. So here's tightening down each one at a time. 2, 3, and 7, and number 8, just like that. I look disgusted for some reason. Did you see my face just now? I wonder what I had in my mind. There we go. Continuing the sequence, 2 strands at the same time, and we're going to be doing that the entire length of the handle. Hold 2 strands together, under 2, over 2, under 2, over 2. So it's almost like an 8 plait because we're plaiting 2 strands at the same time. And this is the part of the whip that is, again, always held in the hand. People are going to be paying quite a bit of attention to the handle of the whip. So I really like to, for cosmetic purposes, of course we could plait this more sloppily if we wanted to, and it wouldn't change the functionality of the whip. But this is a part where the eye is oftentimes drawn to on a whip, the handle. Wherever the knots are, people will kind of look at that first, especially because that's the part you're always holding in the hand when you use the whip. Now that we've tightened those strands at the top, I'm going to go ahead and put it in the clamp right here. I don't want to smash that down too much. It is a very possible thing to just crush the thing, and we don't want to do that. And we're just continuing that sequence. And this is a really a good part of the whip, as far as feeling like you're really starting to get things done. Once you have that handle finished, everything from that point on is kind of just cosmetic, just little embellishments that you can do to a whip to just make it look better. As far as functionality goes, everything has pretty much been taken care of. The importance of the wrapping, the binding, the plaiting of the body of the whip, the thong of the whip. Now here's the point where we have reached the beginning of the thong of the whip. So what we're going to do is just continue plaiting over the top of this transition. Where we cut all those strands from the overlay, we're just going to plait over that a couple of inches. And the reason we're doing this is because it helps us to get a nice seamless transition between the handle and the rest of the whip. So just continuing like nothing ever happened. 2 strands together, under 2, over 2, under 2, over 2, just like that. Again, here it's important to make sure that you pull nice and tight. Looks like this video clip goes on for a little ways, so I'll try to find something interesting to talk about. Yes, so normally I just start the overlay from the top, and they're all solid strands that run all the way to the end of the whip. And this is different. I know this is different, and in the long run it's probably a little bit more time consuming. But I just haven't found a way to inject strands at the transition to expand from 16 to 20 plait in a way that I'm satisfied. As I mentioned, sure, you throw a transition knot over there, especially, if you're putting a metal ferrule there at the transition, it works and it's fine. But for something like this is important to me to get everything nice and flat and smooth, so I just feel more comfortable, even 10 years into my whip making career, just feel more comfortable having the handle separate from the rest of the whip and assembling that separately. Tipper is in the room, listen. You hear her purring? She's on my lap right now as I'm narrating this video. So pretty soon you'll see me start to pull one strand at a time. We're still going under 2, over 2, under 2, over 2. And I'm kind of exaggerating how far past that swell that I really need to go. And that's just to help me ensure that there is solid plaiting in diamond plait past that. We don't want to have any areas that are kind of halfway overlapping. So I'm just going the extra mile here. to make sure that doesn't happen. And we're getting very close. See how short those strands are on the right-hand side? It may have been better if I measured out the strands a little bit longer, even though some may consider it wasteful. It will yield a better product if you have more strand to hang on to when you're pulling the strand. So I probably would have added another 6 inches to each strand just so I have more to grasp as I'm pulling these little strands. Now we're individually tightening everything. And at this point, I'm going to wrap everything behind like this, and I'm going to take some tape to temporarily hold this into place. I'm probably peeling it with my teeth right now because I don't want to let go of the strands. Yeah, I can see my saliva on the tape. That's exactly what I did. And I'm just wrapping that like this. And now what we're going to do is just before that swell, we're going to bind those strands and do just what we did with the overlay strands. And the idea is to try our very best to get these wraps on top of the previous wraps for the overlay. Meaning that when we did all the binding, and then when we cut those strands of the overlay, I'm trying to get this section of binding to be pretty much on top. If not, maybe a 1/4 of an inch, maybe, half an inch at very most. We want these to line up because otherwise, if they don't line up, we'll have to make the transition knot very wide, and that doesn't really look good in my opinion. So here we're just wrapping very tightly. Now see what I'm doing here. I noticed about halfway through that I was wrapping more at an angle. We want this to be 360 degrees around without any slant, because a slant would cause the heel knot foundation to be lopsided. And that doesn't look good. And there's my loop. Give it a few more wraps here, and then we'll cut it and slip it through the eye right about now. Again, holding it, 2 strands, pull it through. Just trim the beginning strand and then the exit strand, just like that. Again, we're taking some more electrical tape just to make sure we don't accidentally cut those wraps. Now we can remove the tape. Oh, playing it risky today, Nick. Wow. That's not a good idea. You should never do that. Just unravel the tape like a normal person. And one at a time, we'll cut those strands. I don't know what I was pointing at there. I muted the video so I could narrate. Yep, chickened out. Back to the scissors. Good call. Very good. One at a time. The only difference here is we have 16 strands to snip. And there we have it. Let's see how we did. Pretty good. That's about a 1/2 inch. And this is where our transition knot foundation is going to be. So what I'm going to do is take some of the hockey tape, and I'm just going to split it down a little bit because I don't want it to be the full width. That would be too wide. I just want to cover the area of where the wraps are. And that will just kind of ensure that nothing will become unraveled, even though there's very little chance it would be, especially when it's underneath a heel knot foundation. But there we go. There we go. As you can see, I just gave this a roll, and everything is laying down nicely. Okay, the first thing I have here is some artificial sinew, and I am just tightly binding the last inch of the handle. And the reason we're doing this is we're momentarily going to be cutting off those end strands. And hopefully it's going to be flush with the steel. So I wrapped this very heavily. I skipped through the video a little bit so you wouldn't see me wrapping for 2-3 minutes. Now I have some hockey tape that I'm once again doing a revolution or two, just to ensure that those strands don't come unraveled. Next, we're at the workbench, and I have here a fresh razor blade. And the idea is to just guess where the end of the steel is. And I have a pretty good idea of where it is. And I'm just going to cut all the way through the end of the handle. And if we did it right, we should just be glancing, just grazing the end of the steel rod. And this is the reason that we always start bellies and overlays 1/4 of an inch above, so we don't have to grind down steel. I hate having to grind down steel. So we did pretty good. Now I'm just trimming the top with the scissors and then melting those strands so there's no fraying going on. You'll see me take the lighter here and just tap the top to ensure that it's nice and flat. Again, we don't want this to be slanted. It's very important that it's cut off evenly. Next, I have 2 folded 5-foot strands of gutted parachute cord, and then I have here a 3rd strand that's 2.5 feet. And we're going to be making a wrist loop. We're going to be making a 5-strand flat braided wrist loop. So I'm just taking that 3rd strand and just tucking it in the middle, and into the vise it goes. Now, if you've never braided a flat braid before, this might be a little intimidating, but we just cross those strands in the middle there, or almost in the middle, and we're just going to be taking the strands from the outside and going under, over, like that. We're working the strands, the outermost strands, to the inside. So from the right, under, over, alternate to the left, under, over, back to the right, under, over. We're just working those furthest strands on the outsides. We're bringing them in, under and over. And I'll show you a different view here as we've worked our way down. And I want to be pulling these strands tight enough to where they're locked into place, and ideally there's no spaces in between them. Under, over, pull tight, under, over. And I'm just going to be doing this sequence the entire length of the wrist loop, the whole way until basically I run out. So here's the finished wrist loop. Just stretching it a little bit to make sure all those strands are flat, all the tension is kind of equalized. And this is about the size that it's going to be. Now I'm laying the wrist loop across here, across the whip, and just kind of seeing where I want it to rest. Now, what I'm doing is I'm just measuring. I want this to be 36 millimeters. So I'm taking this artificial sinew, and from the top of the handle where we cut that off flat, I'm going to wrap down to 36 millimeters. And this is important to wrap very tightly here. Even though we're going to have some staples and nails in it to hold it permanently, I just feel better about getting things tight from the beginning. Now we're going to flip it over, and on the exact opposite side, we're going to take the other end of the wrist loop, make sure that it's not twisted. That's frustrating when you get done and notice there's a twist in it. And I'm just going to lay it across in the 12 o'clock position, opposite from the 6 o'clock position of the first end. And I'm continuing wrapping with this artificial sinew, again very tightly. Just going around and around. And notice I've gone all the way up to the top, and I don't want to exceed the top of the handle. I don't want to pass the top and kind of creep up the wrist loop. I want to stop at the very top. Now here is a piece. Again, I'm measuring with this. That piece of lead that you just saw that we'll be using temporarily, momentarily, is 36 millimeters wide. So that's a nice little gauge for me to make sure that I stop at the 36 millimeter mark. So I've snipped the strands, kind of inspecting to make sure everything's even. And the next thing I'm doing now is just putting a couple of staples through the wrist loop itself. And this is sort of the permanent anchor that's going to ensure that this never slips or never separates. Again, here's a couple more staples on the opposite side. And as good as the staple gun is, it's just not satisfactory as far as getting those staples in all the way. So I like to take this little jeweler's hammer and just give it a couple of pretty significant smacks with the hammer. At this point, I'm cutting those strands off flush at 36 millimeters, making sure they're even, just one at a time, snipping them at the base of the wrapping of that artificial sinew. And we're just going to dress things up a little bit, snip that beginning strand. And that looks pretty good. Just going to dress things up a little bit more with the point of the scissors here. Just snip those fringes off. I don't want them to be visible when the knot is finished. Now I have here a piece of 1/32 inch thick lead. And what we're going to do is we're going to cut a couple of strips. And the idea of doing this is to fill in the area where the wrist loop is not. So basically, where those two wrist loops join the handle, that's a few millimeters thicker. So if we just left it the way it is now, it'd be more of an oval, but we want every layer of this heel knot foundation to be perfectly round. So we're just making up for it with these little strips of lead. Again, 36 millimeters wide. Now, a lot of people will ask me why I use lead. There's a bit of controversy at times about using lead in projects as far as toxicity goes. But what I've found through research is that if you're grinding lead or you're melting it or whatever, you can get fine powder into the air, and the real trouble is when you breathe that into my understanding. So every time I work with lead on a whip, I always wash my hands thoroughly afterwards. And at the end of the day, there is no lead exposed on my whips. It's completely covered in artificial sinew and hockey tape and paracord at the end. So that's kind of my take on it. So here's the first piece. Put a little staple in there just to hold it. We're going to flip it over, and we have the other piece. So the edges of the lead on the sides are just touching those wrist loops. And this is just going to round things up. Another thing I really like about lead is it's so soft, it's easy to work. You can cut it with the scissors. And the mass of lead is just incredible. So on a really heavy, long whip like this, it adds beautiful balance to the end of the whip. So I like working with it, and it's been good. If you guys know any alternatives to lead that's perhaps safer, although I feel confident in the way I work with lead, but if you have any alternative ideas, let me know in the comments section. So now I just have some artificial sinew that I've wrapped very tightly around those two pieces of lead and the end of the handle. And now I'm taking the hammer and I'm just making a bit of a reduction to the overall thickness of where those wrist loop ends attach. They're slightly taller than where the lead is, so I'm just rounding things off. Next, there's just a little few pieces here that I want to start to eliminate, because in the end I want the top to be flat. So just some little pieces, little fringes that I'm cutting off. Next, I'm taking the hammer and just shaping the top edges. There's a little piece of lead there that's kind of bothering me, in addition to some artificial sinew, so I just got that out of there with the razor blade. It's a little risky to do this with the razor blade so close to the wrist loop, but just do it slowly. Next, I have a 35 millimeter wide strip of that lead. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to wrap this around once, make one revolution so where the ends touch. But notice, I want the ends to be flush on the top of the handle. So I'm wrapping it all the way around, just kind of getting the measurement there, marking it with my fingernail. Again, a beautiful thing about lead, you can just mark it with your fingernail or tools, score it just to make a measurement. So I'm trimming this like that. And I want to wrap this lead all the way around. And notice there's a little bit of a difference in size on the handle end. See that little step? What that does is it creates more roundness to the knot in the end result. So I'm going to go all the way around, and hopefully these two ends meet. That's what we're aiming for. They did not, so we just have to make a little bit of reduction to the edge there of our lead sheet. And that's about perfect right there. See, the two ends are meeting. Again, the top is flush, and the bottom, the handle part, there's about a 1 millimeter difference in size, and we'll address that later. We'll talk about why we have that in further detail. So here's a few staples going in to really just kind of anchor this down. Some people kind of make fun of me sometimes about how many staples I use, but I just like to be sure. This is a whip for a client, for my friend Johnny, and I don't want this thing coming apart when he's having fun with it. It'd be a bad day, so I feel like it's worth it to take the extra few minutes to just put a few more in, just for good measure, to make sure it's not going anywhere. Now I'm just tapping these staples in with a hammer. Everything's looking pretty good. Again, making a little bit more of a reduction to that top. Now I'm taking the edge of the hammer, and this is a really fun, satisfying part. I'm just rounding off the edges of the lead, and watch just how beautifully those edges of the lead just fold down and create a smooth, rounded off surface. If we left it the way it is right now, the paracord wouldn't seat very well over the knot foundation. So I really like doing this. It just makes everything look better, makes it look smoother. It's actually really fun. And just kind of tapping those in. This does not take much force at all. As a matter of fact, I could even take a pair of pliers or just tap on it so lightly. But that just folds everything nicely. I'm doing the same thing to the top. See that? I'm just folding those little edges of the lead over the top. A few more smacks there to the top of where the wrist loop is, kind of creeping out on me a little bit. The next thing I have here is another strip of lead. This one is 27 millimeters wide. And this one's going to go basically right in the middle of that wrap we just did. Now you'll notice that we are wrapping pieces of lead in decreasing widths, and that is to just encourage the overall round shape of the knot itself, to try to get that David Morgan style look. So that looks good. We're going to wrap this around again. Or I should say we're wrapping this one 360 degrees around. Every time we wrap lead around this heel knot foundation, it's only going around once and the edges are touching. We're not wrapping around more than once. So I've marked it again. I'm snipping it. And again, the edges should meet flush. That looks pretty good. That's right in the middle where we want it. Got a couple of staples here in mind. There's one there. You'll notice that when you are driving staples into lead, it's not too much of a problem, but once you have several pieces of lead like we have here and we're about to have another, sometimes they don't want to go in. And I don't know if that's just the spring on my staple gun that's wearing out. It's probably a combination of both. But I just like to grab that jeweler's hammer once again and just really make sure that all those staples are as far in as they can possibly go. Again, we're tilting the whole assembly on its side and just rounding off that secondary wrap of lead for the same reason. We're just rounding off the corners to where it's just more round instead of square. I'm not a big fan of square heel knots, and Mr. Morgan wasn't either, because he always had that nice rounded knot shape that fits in the hand so well. Nice and smooth. Again, we're doing the same thing to the top that we just did to the handle end. Just rounding off those edges to make sure everything is smooth. We don't want any sharp edges to potentially tear through our parachute cord, although that probably wouldn't happen, but just makes it look better. And now we have one last piece of lead that's again going to go in the middle, and this piece of lead is 20 millimeters wide. So let's go ahead and put a staple in. A little off center, but that's okay. And again, this is going to wrap around once. It's going to make one revolution. Now I got a little old sweatband here. Sometimes if you don't feel comfortable driving in the staples in fear of making things out of round, you can put something like that down. I'm not going to be using it for the rest of the video because I'm not going to be pounding it too hard. But here we go. 1 revolution, the ends should meet flush, just like that. That looks pretty good. We're going to go ahead and grab our staple gun and put a few more staples in place. Do a few more. Now, the more staples that you drive into this heel knot foundation assembly, the more staples you drive in, the more likely it is that you'll accidentally run into one underneath. And that happens. If it happens, the staple will crumple and just grab a pair of pliers and pull it out. Lastly, I have here a few wire brad nails. And maybe I'm a paranoid fellow, but I just like to make sure that these nails go all the way to the steel. I don't feel like those staples went all the way. The staples, in my opinion, are more geared towards making sure all the lead pieces are fused together. And these nails will ensure that they go through not only the lead, but all the way into the bellies of the whip, all the way to the steel. So this thing is never going anywhere. So I'm just driving them in until I feel friction, and then I'm just snipping them off with that little nippers that I just used. Let's do another one. There's a fly buzzing around. See that? So we got quite a bit of distance. That probably is touching our steel handle. Lop it off and just tap it into the assembly itself. And once more, what we're going to be doing after we put maybe 1 or 2 more nails in is we're going to be shaping that final strip of lead. Little snip there and pound it into the rest of it. And here we are, we're just shaping off the edges. And see that nice little staggered sequence there? That's going to really look nice when everything is flattened. And when that paracord is tied over this thing, it's going to look nice and round. Just shaping the top a little bit as well. This is sort of one of those things where if you don't call it at some point, you're just going to be tapping this thing forever. It's kind of like writing a song or building anything else. If you don't just defeat your perfectionism. Here, let's just put 1 more staple in just to pull it out right after we drive it in. I still don't know why I did that. Next thing I'm going to do is grab some hockey tape. And what we're going to do is just wrap this whole thing for several reasons. For one, we're covering all that lead so it's not exposed anymore. No more worry about that. And secondly, it's going to provide a grippy surface for that parachute cord to adhere to when we tie our knot. So we'll snip that and just kind of press it in with my hands to make sure it's sticking. And we'll wrap a thinner piece around the top too. I don't believe I showed that. So even after you wrap it with your hockey tape, you might notice it might make apparent some edges that are not perfect. So that's why I tapped it with the hammer. Now, I really want this top to be completely flat because I'm about ready to take a little aluminum disc like this and I epoxied it to the top. You'll see I took 2 little pieces of parachute cord just to fill that in a little bit. And I just 5-minute epoxied that. It's got my little emblem on there with the whip number 514, and that's what it looks like from the side. Okay, it's time to tie a 2-pass 7x6 Turk's head knot. I have here an 8-foot piece of parachute cord that has been gutted, and a lacing needle has been thread on to the end. So what we're going to do here is just hold it at a 45-degree angle like this, go around over that strand. And I've tied this knot plenty of times on this channel, but I'm just going to go ahead and show you the whole process. Hopefully it'll help you just sort of navigate the way a knot is tied around a wrist loop It's a little bit different even though the shape of the knot is the same. So again, because this strand is so long, we're going to end up with a few twists that we have to kind of dismantle as we work our way through. And we'll just work through this. We're going to go under this one. When you tie these knots, it's important to make sure that you're resisting the temptation to pull so tightly. We want to let the natural filling in of those strands be ultimately what tightens the knot. And then when we go to wax the whip at the end, the wax will also help that knot and the rest of the whip strands tighten up. So as you can see also, I have tied the wrist loop in a little knot, and that just kind of helps me keep it out of the way as I tie this knot. And you may look at this and say, man, is everything going to fill in? And it will. If you use the measurements that I talked about with the lead as the foundation, everything will just sort of fill in perfectly, and you'll be left with a nice 2-pass 7x6 knot. So what we're doing at this point is we're just doing the expansion pass pretty soon. Not quite yet. Almost, I misspoke there. Go under this one. And at this point, the knot is a 5x4. And once we pull this strand through, we're going to begin the expansion pass. So basically, everything that lead strand, that beginning strand did, we're going to do on the right side all the way up to the top. Again, pulling out those twists. And we're going to mimic it. We're going to do exactly what it does on the right side, right alongside it. See, that one goes under, we're also going to go under. But then when we reach the top, and this is only for the expansion pass, when we reach the top, we're going to lay that strand across that little X there and just pick it up on the other side. Now, on the way down, we're going to the left. Everything that strand does, we're doing the same thing, but we're following on the left-hand side. So it went under, and we're also going to go under. Now it goes over, we go over, and then under again. Pulling those twists out once again. And now we're going to finish that expansion pass. Basically, everything that those strands do, we're going to do the opposite. So now we're going to go under, we're going to split these strands. I'm going to pull this strand out. And this is an easy place to get carried away and pull too tightly. We don't want to do that. And now we're going to do the opposite of what the two do on the left and the right. So we're going to go over that one there and under that one, kind of digging it out, pulling it out. And now we have to go under that one, so we're going to dig that out a little bit. Kind of pushing the strands aside. So I'm just kind of prying it out with the needle there. We're going to go under. Pulling the slack out. We're going to go over that one and under that one. And you'll notice that everything is a little bit sloppy at this point, meaning that all of the strands are not really centered. They're all just sort of not random, but they're not evenly spaced. And we'll take care of that as soon as we finish this expansion pass. So we're going to go over that one and under this one here that I'm currently going under. And once we finish this point right here, this is kind of the bare bones of the knot. So all the hard work is done. Now we're just going to be kind of sliding these strands around. And we want there to be pretty much an even space between all of the strands. That's kind of what we're going for. So I'm just kind of shimmying things around, shifting strands around, and just making all those spaces more or less even between each strand. Also, I'm kind of examining the top to make sure that it's not going too high, although I do want it to just be touching the base of where the wrist loops are attached to the whip itself. So again, this is a really important reason why we don't tie the knot so tightly from the beginning. If we tied it super tight from the beginning, all of these strands wouldn't be nearly as easy to move around as they are now. So see, everything is a little more even now, and we have plenty of room for our second pass. And that looks about good to me. So what I'm going to do now at this point is everything that strand does, turn your phone off. Everything that strand does, we're going to do exactly what it does on the right-hand side. So it went under, we're going to go under. And from here on out to the end of the knot, we're doing everything that it does on the right side, meaning when we descend from the top, we're not switching over to the left like we did for the expansion pass. We're just sticking to the right the whole way. See that? Under. All the way up to the top. And we're still sticking right by its side on the right-hand side. So you have a nice guide, basically. When you finish that first pass of the 7x6 knot, completing the second pass is so easy because you basically have a guide. It's that first strand. So everything it does, you do the same, carry it out on the right-hand side. And this is the really kind of exciting part when you start to see that knot materializing. When you start to see all those little black squares going away, that's an indicator that you're in danger of finishing this thing. And it's a wonderful feeling to have a knot nearly complete after all that hard work of braiding 12 feet of parachute cord. And you should be proud of yourself if you've made it to this point. If you've braided a whole 12-foot overlay with 3 plaited bellies, that is quite an accomplishment. So you should be happy with yourself. And we're just continuing. We're just following that leader and filling in the spaces. And now you'll see this second pass is starting to just touch, and that's just where we want it. It's starting to touch the wrist loop attachment area. And the nice thing about these knots is that if things are a little bit too crowded on the top, we can just take our thumb and just kind of push them down around the edges of the knot. So see, what I did here is I accidentally went through the parachute cord instead of under it. Sometimes you can tear a little tiny thread and it makes a horrible sound because you're passing a needle through the thread itself instead. Oh, the plant is starting to act up a little bit over there in the corner. So now we're just going under these. Very good. The plant is grabbing the whip. I think this is another installment of Jumanji, apparently. Okay, so here we are. We're going under that one. And we'll just let this play out. We'll just go ahead and tie this knot. See, I'm just kind of pushing things around as need be. The plant is again grabbing the whip. It's called a bleeding heart is the name of that plant. It's a really beautiful plant that blooms in May. Can't wait to see those again. It's winter now. You know what sounds really good right now? A 1928 Gibson F5 mandolin. But they're so expensive. They're so incredibly expensive. And they're hard to find, too. They're hard to find. And if you can find them, they are thousands of dollars. They're very expensive, but they're just fantastic instruments. The mandolin I have right now it's an Ibanez. And you know, I enjoy Ibanez guitars. I do. But not Ibanez mandolins. And it's an entry-level mandolin. I've been playing guitar longer than I have mandolin, but I'm starting to really get into playing mandolin, especially since my friends have started a folk band and they've invited me to play as a guest in some of their songs. If you want to check them out, they're called the Help Hounds. HELPHOUNDS, the Help Hounds. They're just about to release a new song. You can listen to them on Spotify or iTunes or Amazon Music, wherever you find your music. But check them out. They're my good friends. And they just started this band about 6-7 months ago. They got a few shows coming up in Chicago, so I'll be there. I'll put some information about them and their show's in the description. If you guys want to stop by and say hello, I'll be there. You can see the dates of when the shows are, I should say, coming up in about a month or two. But yeah, I'd really like to get a nice mandolin. There's something really special about the idea of playing a vintage instrument. I like the idea of playing an instrument that's older than me. There's just something kind of solemn about it. Like you think about the luthier who made that instrument, and you just kind of think about, perhaps you just finished a song that you've been working on for several weeks, and then you just sit kind of alone and play that song, and you're proud of yourself, and then you kind of think of them, the person who built that instrument, sitting across from you, even though they've long passed away. You think to yourself, man, I feel like they'd be proud of me, and that's kind of a neat feeling, So that's why I like the idea of a nice vintage instrument. They were built so well back then, a lot of the high quality, good name brands. So if any of you have an old Gibson mandolin that you've had laying around the house for years, maybe you inherited it and you perhaps want to sell it, let me know. I'm in the market for something, of course, not as expensive as an F5, but maybe an A-style mandolin, different shape. The F-style mandolins have that fancy little curve, that little curly cue, and they take so much longer to make, and that's why they're a lot more expensive to my understanding. But the tone you get is just fantastic. If you want to hear some fantastic mandolin, I just used that word twice, but I think it's needed for what I'm about to say, and it makes sense to say fantastic. Chris Thile is, in my opinion, one of the absolute best mandolin players in the world. He played in a band called Nickel Creek for years, and he's done some solo stuff recently, and very inspirational. Whatever you do, whatever instrument you play, whatever craft or skill or hobby you have that you want to get better at, if you watch some videos of Chris Thile, he'll inspire you to just do your best at whatever you're doing. So that was my little rant about music. So we're just coming up here on the end of this knot. See, it's getting a little bit hard to pull that, or to push that needle through. That's okay. That's what we want. See, I haven't been pulling these strands so tightly. It's just the natural filling in of the spaces that's causing the knot to take shape and the strands to tighten up. And you'll notice that when you get towards the end of the knot, all of those little twists in the strands will be a little bit more challenging to slide through. And the knot is pretty much done. I just snipped off the ends and melted them and pressed them into the core. Now we're going to tie a 2-pass 5x4. So I have a 4-foot piece of gutted parachute cord, and I'm tying this basically the same way. Create a little X there. We're going to go over that one, holding it with my thumb. A little cat hair on there. We're going to go under this one. And this is when things really start to take shape. Go under that one. Again, this is a knot that I've tied plenty of times on this channel, but we'll go ahead and let it go. We'll let it play. Just let it play through. So I'm using a GoPro Hero 9 camera for these shots, and I don't know how I feel about it yet. Even though it does have image stabilization, it is kind of dizzying, if you will, So let me know if you guys enjoy the GoPro. Last time I used a GoPro for one of my videos, it was like a Hero 3 or a Hero 4. It was an old camera. This one shoots in 5K, and the resolution is a lot higher. The dynamic range is much better, meaning that it's better at detecting both brightness and shadows more evenly without one of them being more intense than the other. So GoPro has kind of come a long way, I think. I mean, still, I'll take my Sony DSLR cameras any day over a GoPro. But a GoPro's nice just because it's so small, So I guess kind of, that's sort of the sacrifice you make. It's a tiny little camera you can stick in your pocket. But it just does not compete with that larger image sensor and just overall higher quality camera that a Sony DSLR is. So see, I'm just kind of working the slack. Notice I'm just pulling finger tight. I'm not grabbing that strand, just pulling it with all my might. Just slipping it through, pulling with just a few ounces of pressure. Give it a little tug there. So that's the first pass of the 5x4. And then the same thing that we did last time, as far as following the leader, we're just going to do that. Everything that strand does, we're going to do on the right. That's what we're doing right now. And this knot is, of course, much quicker because it's a 5x4 as opposed to a 7x6. So that goes through there. And the further you get to completing the knot, you can start to pull a little bit tighter. But again, I did a video a couple years ago about pulling too tightly with Turk's head knots. If you pull too tightly, especially on the first pass, what happens is all those strands will just constrict and they get pulled over the top of the knot foundation. And this is particularly common on heel knots. You know, it'll pull it right over the side and then it exposes the heel knot foundation and it just looks really bad. And it took me so long to resist the temptation to pull tightly. I thought, man, I'm tying a knot. I'm supposed to tie as tight as I can, right? And not necessarily. You know, you're just letting the shape of the knot, letting all those unders and overs just do the natural tightening. And it's really cool how it works. I've had several knots. I've tied a few 9x8 Turk's head knots, and I do have a video on that. And when I first started tying those knots, I was conscious of the fact that you're not supposed to pull so insanely tightly. I knew I wasn't supposed to do that, but I still found myself pulling just a little too tight. So what I'm learning after all these 10 years is that the more bites you have in your knot, the higher the number is, like a 9x8. You just pull less with less force. You just have so many more unders and overs that it just tightens itself. So you wouldn't believe how delicately I pull when I'm tying a 9x8 Turk's head knot. I might do another video about that. I'd like to revisit. First off, I'd love to learn. I don't know how to do this right now as I'm speaking. I don't know how to tie particularly a herringbone knot is what I'm referring to. I don't know how to tie a tricolor herringbone knot. I just know how to do two colors. But I'd like to learn. I've seen some beautiful whips by Torrance Fisher of Sword Guy Builds. Particularly, I mentioned him because I just saw a few of his whips recently. And Tori, he's gotten into leather whips as well. And he's been making leather whips for a while now, probably a few years. And he's doing really well. And it's inspiring. But anyway, tricolored herringbone knots. It's something I'd like to learn and then share with you guys if I'm able to. And we're just see how tight everything is getting. Look at that little twist there. It was hard to push that through. Now I did kind of cut the video a little bit abruptly with the Turk's head knot at the end, and I apologize for that. I'm not sure why I did that. But basically, I was pretty much done with it. All I did was I just pulled the beginning strand, and then I pulled the final strand, and then snipped them and melted them. And that's really all I did off camera. And this is just about finished. So we're going to go over here. And this is what I did to the end knot, the heel knot. I snipped them like this, and I left about an inch. And then I just grabbed the hammer and the lighter and the scissors. I'm sitting back down now. And I'm just going to kind of shape this knot with the jeweler's hammer that we were using earlier. And if you wanted to, you could roll this knot too. But because I'm so, kind of particular about this whip, the hammer just gets in all those little creases, especially where those strands make contact with the handle itself. You just can't beat, a piece of metal, kind of slapping the corner there and tucking those strands in. And after the fact, you can roll it to just kind of take care of the sides and the main shape, especially the top of the knot. But especially for the corners, I like to use the hammer. I just think it works a lot better. As you can see, I've already rolled the heel knot. Apparently, I did that off camera as well. I apologize for that. So now we can snip these with leaving about 1 millimeter and just a little melt there, and then press it into the corner. Try to get it as neat as you can. It's very challenging to get paracord to look good after you melt it when it's on a knot, but do what you can. Burn myself there. Did you see me jump? That's what you get, Nick. Put some tape on your fingers. There we go. So I'm just kind of beating the devil out of it, as Bob Ross used to say. And there we go, my friends. The only thing we have to do left is to wax the whip. And you guys know how to do that. I have videos on it. Johnny, my friend, I hope you are having a great time with this whip. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.